a child of calamity, a queen of strength. She was never supposed to be queen. She was never even supposed to survive. The story of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, is one of triumph, tragedy, and an indomitable will to survive in the face of certain doom.
Elizabeth is just the most fascinating figure.
She would face assassins, traitors, and armies. She would defy popes, kings, and even fate itself. And in the end, she would carve her name into history, not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a ruler. The last Tudor, the Virgin Queen, and the woman who changed England forever. Elizabeth I was born on September 7th, 1533, in the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been crowned queen only to be executed by her father, Henry VIII, when Elizabeth was just 2 years old.
Elizabeth's mother, Anne, is executed when she's 2 years old, and it is an enormous change for Elizabeth. In fact, she notices it herself. She actually says to her governess, you know, why yesterday were you calling me Lady Princess and now you're calling me Lady Elizabeth? Because she notices a drop in status. She goes from being heir to the throne to being simply the king's illegitimate daughter, because he declares her illegitimate by Act of Parliament. So she's still raised in the royal nursery, she still has royal attendance, but she's no longer heiress and she's no longer a secure, legitimate member of the royal family. And in fact, we know that she quickly outgrows all of her clothes, and because her mother isn't there to take care of her needs, actually, her governess has to write to the king's chief minister and say, you know, what do you want me to do about Elizabeth? She's got no clothes. So in general, she's quite neglected by Henry. He never denies that she's his daughter, but he doesn't pay any particular attention to her. And she's actually further overshadowed when her half-brother Edward is born in 1537, and he joins the royal nursery, and he becomes very much the centre of her governess's attentions.
Her mother's execution marked the beginning of a life filled with uncertainty. Elizabeth would spend much of her youth in the shadow of her stepmothers and half-siblings. At the age of 25, Elizabeth was crowned queen.
She finally becomes queen on the death of her half-sister Mary in November 1558. And I mean, her accession is just an amazing achievement because it's so unexpected. If you'd asked Henry VIII back at his death to rank his children, Elizabeth would definitely be the least of his children. And yet, actually, she is the one that we really remember. She reigns for 44 years, and it's remembered as a time of general prosperity. It's the age of Shakespeare, it's the age of exploration, and Elizabeth's right at the centre, reigning alone.
Elizabeth had lived through a hostile and dangerous court, where her rivals were often her own family members. She was declared illegitimate after her mother's execution, and throughout her youth, there were numerous plots against her life. Even when she was young, her life was in constant danger. Her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who also had a claim to the throne, became a perpetual thorn in Elizabeth's side. But Elizabeth had learned to be politically astute, quick-witted, and above all, cautious.
Following her accession at Hatfield, Elizabeth makes her way to London amidst cheering crowds. She becomes queen of a Catholic nation, and she actually struggles to find a bishop who will crown her. The Archbishop of Canterbury has actually died on the same day as Mary, but probably would not have been willing to crown her heretical half-sister. She's finally crowned by the Bishop of Carlisle. And I mean, this is a really lowly bishopric. This shows, in the hierarchy of bishops, this shows how difficult it was for Elizabeth to even secure her coronation. But she's met by cheering crowds. She is Henry VIII's daughter. And in fact, her coronation portrait is very much reminiscent of her father. She's displaying herself as Henry VIII's daughter.
When she took the throne, England was a divided kingdom. Catholic and Protestant factions fought bitterly for power. Many saw her as a compromise candidate between the two faiths, but Elizabeth didn't just survive, she thrived.
I think it is safe to say that Elizabeth was a Protestant, but when she came to the throne, she knew that she had to be pragmatic. She knew that she needed to unify her kingdom, and therefore she tried to enact a policy, almost a don't ask and don't say. She stated that she had no desire to open windows into men's souls, and this must have been something of a relief to her kingdom. However, there were Catholic factions who were entirely opposed to Elizabeth's rule. They deemed her as illegitimate because of how her mother had been executed. And therefore, I think it's safe to say that Elizabeth became increasingly intolerant of those with a Catholic faith. She saw them as foreign. She didn't believe that they could be trusted. And this was compounded by numerous plots against her life that were enacted by Catholics.
One of Elizabeth's most defining achievements was her role in the religious Reformation. Her sister, Mary I, had attempted to return England to Catholicism, leading to the execution of hundreds of Protestants. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was committed to restoring the Protestant faith without the bloodshed.
There was something of a sigh of relief in the country who had been exposed to quite radical measures in order to enact the counter-Reformation to return the country back to the Catholic faith. And they hoped that the young Elizabeth would provide more stability, more peace and harmony.
While many were dissatisfied with the compromise Elizabeth's settlement offered, she had managed to avoid the violent religious conflicts that plagued much of Europe. Under Elizabeth, England was largely able to hold its religious course, navigating the tensions between Catholicism and Protestantism, while promoting a sense of unity. Perhaps one of the most famous moments in Elizabeth's reign was the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Spain, under the Catholic King Philip II, sought to invade England and restore Catholicism, viewing Elizabeth as a heretic. The Spanish Armada was a massive fleet of ships, 130 vessels, intended to bring England to its knees. But Elizabeth's navy, under commanders like Francis Drake, was smaller, quicker, and more agile. The English fleet launched a series of successful attacks, aided by storms that destroyed much of the Spanish Armada. The victory was seen as a miracle by many and bolstered Elizabeth's popularity and the sense of English national pride. The defeat of the Armada was a pivotal moment in English history, cementing Elizabeth as a strong, capable monarch and protecting the future of Protestantism in England.
The English were expecting an invasion from Spain, and Philip built a great fleet, the Spanish Armada, and it's not intended to be a naval fleet, it's intended to carry troops to England for a land-based invasion. So Elizabeth goes to her troops at Tilbury to try and ready her forces, because actually English monarchs don't have standing armies, so she needs to raise enough troops to fight this Spanish invasion. And she makes the speech of her life to her troops. She talks about having the body of a weak and feeble woman, but having the heart and stomach of a king and a king of England. She really rallies the troops. She portrays herself as a war leader, as a successor of the mighty warrior kings of England of the past. It's an outstanding speech, the speech of her life. Actually, when she makes it, the Armada has already been defeated. Her commanders, Lord Howard of Effingham and Francis Drake, are able to scatter the Spanish fleet, partly by aid of a Protestant wind that blows in the English favour, but also skillful tactics. For example, they send fire ships into the Spanish fleet, which burn the ships. The Armada is entirely scattered, and in fact, the ships that remain have to sail all the way around Scotland and Ireland to get home to Spain because they just cannot go back down the English Channel. It is a triumph of Elizabeth's reign. The defeat of the Armada was the high point of Elizabeth's reign, and we know Elizabeth was a great propagandist, and she was determined to use this to create capital on a European stage. And one way that she did this is actually through iconography. We've got the Armada portrait, which was commissioned, and it shows Elizabeth in her absolute prime. Her dress is absolutely enormous. Her hair is big. She's looking powerful. Behind her, you can see the Spanish Armada being defeated. And it shows Elizabeth as the monarch that she wants to present to the world. She is a warrior queen. She is at the absolute height of her powers.
Elizabeth was an object of constant fascination. Her beauty, intelligence, and command of language were legendary, and she became a symbol of strength and resilience. But beneath the public persona, Elizabeth was ruthless when it came to political maneuvering. One of the most intriguing aspects of Elizabeth's reign was her refusal to marry. For much of her life, the question of her marriage was a source of both political and personal turmoil. There were numerous suitors: Philip II of Spain, the Duke of Anjou, and Sir Robert Dudley, among others.
Elizabeth had a number of foreign suitors and also English favourites throughout her reign, and some she seems to have become very, very close to. Robert Dudley is undoubtedly her favourite. He is her master of horse. He's a childhood friend. She clearly loves him dearly. Unfortunately, when she becomes queen, he is married to Amy Robsart, and he is happy to leave his wife in the countryside while he comes to court and flirts with the Queen. Amy Dudley is very much neglected by Robert, and she's not allowed to come to court. In 1560, she is discovered dead at the foot of a flight of stairs with a broken neck. And this, of course, causes absolute uproar because it looks very much like Robert Dudley has murdered his wife. And indeed, Mary Queen of Scots herself says that the Queen of England is going to marry her horsekeeper who's murdered. Dudley is stunned when he hears the news of his wife's death. So although the exact circumstances of Amy's death have never been proven, it does seem unlikely that it was Robert, although he clearly did rather wish that he was free and could marry the Queen. Suicide seems quite a likely explanation for Amy's death, and that perhaps she was moved by her servants to make it look like an accident. But whatever the circumstances are, the death of Amy Dudley made it impossible for Elizabeth to marry Robert. She simply could not marry a man who was implicated in the murder of his wife. But the two remain close throughout Robert Dudley's lifetime, and he does keep trying to marry her. At one stage, he invites her to Kenilworth Castle, where for 19 days he really tries to persuade her to take the plunge to marry him. There are fireworks displays, there are entertainments. Sometimes he goes a little bit too far. There's an entertainment about a nymph called Zabetta, who is persuaded to marry at the end of this long pageant, and actually Elizabeth is furious when she hears what's going to be said in the pageant. So Robert keeps trying. Eventually, desperate to have an heir of his own, he secretly marries Lettice Knollys, who is Elizabeth's cousin, causing a breach. Lettice is never allowed back at court, although Robert Dudley is eventually allowed back. Elizabeth is devastated when Dudley dies in 1588, to the extent that actually after her death, a letter from him was found that she'd always kept with her that was written, his last letter, in her hand. She also has other favourites and other suitors. Her main foreign suitor is Francis, Duke of Anjou, who is a French prince. He's many years younger than Elizabeth, but he has the advantage that he is the foreign prince that came to see her. Elizabeth always said she would never marry a man that she hadn't seen, which in practice meant that she couldn't marry most foreign princes because no foreign prince would risk rejection of coming to England and then being turned away by the Queen. Francis, Duke of Anjou, however, was different. He was prepared to chance it, so he came to meet with Elizabeth. And although he was renowned for being small and unattractive, he was very pockmarked from childhood smallpox. He seems to have charmed Elizabeth.
However, Elizabeth was determined to remain independent. She once famously declared herself the Virgin Queen, using her single status as a political tool to keep suitors and foreign powers at bay. She used marriage proposals to strengthen diplomatic ties, but in reality, she remained married to her kingdom.
I think Elizabeth learnt a huge amount about the risks that came with marriage from her mother's downfall. Indeed, I think these risks were also compounded when, at only 9 years old, the same thing happened again to her stepmother, Catherine Howard. I think Elizabeth learnt a huge amount about how vulnerable women were to their husbands, how subservient they had to be. And Elizabeth was also keenly aware from her sister Mary's example that in order to rule as a woman in your own right, you really had to do so alone, because when a husband is introduced into the equation, he automatically becomes king and therefore superior to the queen. I think all of these ingredients were foundational to Elizabeth's decision never to marry.
This decision to stay unmarried was not without consequence. In the eyes of many European monarchs, Elizabeth's refusal to marry was a sign of weakness, and her position was often threatened by both external and internal pressures. One of Elizabeth's most difficult and tragic decisions was the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. Mary had been Elizabeth's cousin and a Catholic figurehead who had sought refuge in England after being forced to abdicate the Scottish throne. Over time, Mary became a rallying point for Catholic conspirators who wanted to overthrow Elizabeth. After years of plotting and multiple attempts on Elizabeth's life, Elizabeth was left with no choice but to sign Mary's death warrant. The execution of Mary was a dark moment in Elizabeth's reign and revealed the deep tensions and divisions within England.
Elizabeth reluctantly signed her cousin's death warrant, and this was a really difficult move on Elizabeth's part. She knew that the execution of anointed queen could set a precedent. So we can perhaps understand Elizabeth's reluctance at making this move. Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle, and her execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe, not least in Spain.
Mary's 5 years on the throne were a difficult time for England. Much of it was beyond her control. It was an age of poor weather, of crop failure. Some of it were her political missteps. Her marriage to Philip of Spain pleased almost no one, and in fact didn't please the Queen in the long run. She may have done better to have taken a leaf out of her sister's book and remain unmarried, remain just wedded to her kingdom. Mary is of course remembered as Bloody Mary and for the burnings of her Protestant subjects. But I think we can look beyond much of the negativity of Mary's reign. And I think really her legacy and her importance is that she was the first woman to be crowned as Queen of England. And that is really significant because in her father's reign, certainly, many people did not believe that that could be done. And the fact that Mary reigned alone until Philip arrived and then after Philip left demonstrates just what a strong character and what a strong woman she was.
As Elizabeth grew older, the physical toll of her reign began to show. Her health began to deteriorate in the 1590s, and her once vibrant court became more sombre. The loss of her close advisors like Francis Walsingham and Robert Dudley weighed heavily on her.
Elizabeth and Robert Dudley had an incredibly close relationship. Indeed, she gave him the nickname My Eyes. She also moved his apartments incredibly close to her own, which may suggest indeed that there was an intimacy that went beyond friendship between them. It's incredibly difficult to know what happened behind closed doors, and whether or not she did remain a virgin is almost beside the point. Elizabeth wanted to project herself as the Virgin Queen and was incredibly successful in doing so.
In her final years, Elizabeth faced internal unrest, especially as her death loomed without a clear heir. There were rumors of a succession crisis, but Elizabeth held on. Her death on March 24th, 1603, marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuart era.
Elizabeth was destined to be the last of her dynasty, and of course she knew this. She had no children, she had no nephews and nieces. There was no one else to carry on the Tudor line. So in part, of course, her legacy is dynastic change, and the fact that the King of Scots became the King of England and united the two kingdoms. But her legacy is so much more than this. Although she's not the first English reigning queen or the first reigning queen in the island of Britain, she was undoubtedly the woman that proved that women could reign in England. She reigned for over 40 years and she reigned independently. She didn't have a king and she was very much in control of her kingdom. And I think that's her greatest legacy, really. It is her contribution to English queenship. All subsequent reigning queens have to some extent modelled themselves on Elizabeth. We see this with Queen Anne in the 18th century, for example, who, when she becomes queen, she actually takes as her motto, Semper Idem, always the same. And this was the motto of Elizabeth I. And so this is her legacy. She is the first truly great reigning queen on the island of Britain, and very much this is a legacy that she passed on to subsequent generations.
With the accession of her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England.
I think we're all still so obsessed with the Tudors because of how unrealistic it all is. If this had been the work of fiction, we would think it was pushing credulity. I mean, this is a family who killed one another. This is a family who had a king with 6 queens who killed 2 of them. This is a family with feuding siblings. It has everything for us to enjoy, and we can't get enough of it.
Elizabeth I's reign lasted for 44 years, and she shaped the destiny of England. Her rule brought peace after decades of turmoil, a golden age in the arts, and the consolidation of England as a major European power. Elizabeth was a master of diplomacy, a brilliant tactician, and an icon of strength and independence. She showed the world that a woman could be both a monarch and a force to be reckoned with.